Hi kids, Miss Ruby here with another art lesson from the garden. Today we're going to be working with watercolor. So before we get started with our project, I wanted to give you a chance to get familiar with your materials. So in each kit, you find a stretched piece of watercolor paper. This is to keep the paper flat once you start to add water so it doesn't get those waves in it that we tend to see when the paper dampens. I also gave you a few other pieces of watercolor paper and I marked the back side. Watercolor paper has a front side and a back. The front side is made to absorb water and has a little bit of a texture or a tooth to it. This is cold pressed watercolor paper, so you can kind of see the difference. It has more texture on the front. I also gave you a scrap piece of watercolor paper. This is for you to, kind of experiment with your materials or test out colors before you put them on your paper, so you can see, oh, that's going to be really dark, or oh, that's going to be really light, or trying out, different color combinations to see if you've mixed the color that you really want. So you also have in your kit a watercolor palette. So these watercolors are from tubes, not pans. So the color looks like this when we start, and what I've done is put just a little squeeze of color in each paint well. So the circles are the paint wells. So you'll see yours are labeled with magenta, cadmium red, yellow ochre, lemon yellow, phthalo green, phthalo blue, and ultramarine. So the blues are a little bit different. This is kind of a turquoise blue. This is more of a kind of purpley blue. So you can kind of see the difference if you want to test those out. They have a really different kind of personality to them. This phthalo green is more of a turquoise green. So if you wanted to make a more natural green, you could add some yellow to it, or even add a little bit of orange to it. But you can get into that when we experiment with color mixing. So when you get your palette, your paints are going to be kind of dried out. So in order to activate these or wake them up, you're going to need to add a little bit of water. Okay, so I like to just almost fill up that paint well, and you can let that soak in for a little while, or if you're being, a little impatient, you can also take your brush and kind of mix the color up. Okay, so something that works really well for this is a baby medicine dispenser, so you can kind of just do a little drop, drop. These colors I have added water to, and I let them absorb and activate, and now when I add a little bit more water in, they kind of mix themselves up. So that's what I really like to do. You also in your kit have a water cup with brushes. Okay, so these are beautiful brand new brushes for you guys to try out. So we've got different kinds. The green are the round brushes. We can tell because their ferrule or metal part is round, and the brush kind of comes to a pointed tip. Okay, so there's 3 different sizes of your pointed round brushes. The red ones are flat brushes because they have a flat ferrule and they're flat on top. They're also kind of short, flat brushes that are also sometimes called brights. Okay, so we want to keep really good care of our brushes because those are brand new. You also have a sponge in your kit. So this is for dabbing the excess water off your brush. So once I rinse my brush, kind of clean it off of color, I can wipe on the side of my cup, and then I can dab to take the extra water off. And you'll see why that's important as we get going. You also in your kit have some watercolor pencils. The watercolor pencils are great for sketching, so we can kind of do light lines with those if you're pressing really lightly, using it like a sketching pencil, and we can do a little bit of shading with those as well. So when I'm just using the pencil dry, it looks just like a regular colored pencil, or like a dry brush technique for watercolor. But if I take a damp brush and go over that mark, it activates, it wakes up the paint, and it kind of becomes more fluid. So you can also almost erase this pencil if you go really lightly. So if you were working on some sketching lines that you did pretty lightly and you wanted that to kind of go away, you can just do a little scrub with your brush and it kind of disappears. Okay, so the watercolor pencils are really nice, again, for sketching or for shading and using with water. So we've got our kit here. You also have a plastic tray in your kit, and that is to put your palette on so that you don't make a big mess in your house. Okay, now we can get started with our project. All right, everybody. So for today, we're going to be working on an observation of a flower in watercolor. So we're going to find a flower outside in your garden or wherever you can find an actual flower or a photo of a flower that inspires you. And we're going to do a little sketch of that and then fill in with watercolor. So here's an iris that I did earlier. But I'm going to talk you through looking at a nasturtium flower. So just like when we sketch anything, we want to think about the basic shapes. Okay, so I see the petals are the biggest shapes, but they all come from this kind of central, almost star shape in the center. So I'm going to make mine a little bit larger than I see in real life so that I can add some details. So I'm starting off with a light colored watercolor pencil. Now remember that these don't erase, so I want to start out by sketching as lightly as I can. I see the general shape of the flower is kind of like an oval with these gaps in between the petals. I'm going to think about maybe what space this flower is going to take up in my drawing. So I see that this petal is kind of going up, so that might be kind of in this area. I see this one kind of goes over, just kind of really lightly getting an idea of where these petals are going to fall. And I see this one's turned, so it has kind of an interesting shape. I want to start with that center kind of star shape because everything else is going to kind of come out of that. So I'm really figuring out what that's going to look like before darkening anything else. I can also think about this kind of like a clock. Like if this was the center of the clock, this is kind of pointing over towards, say, 2 o'clock. This is pointing down towards maybe 5 o'clock. This is kind of over maybe 6 or 7 o'clock. This is almost pointing to 9, maybe about 11. So I want to think about which direction these are going. So I see this petal starts out in between these, and it kind of swoops up and over. It's kind of curving to the left here. And this is a lot like the sketches we did of a hawk or the landscape, starting with big things first, not getting into too much detail yet. So this one I see has a really skinny part, and then it gets really wide up here. And this kind of does the same thing. It starts off with this really skinny part, and then gets really wide. And this is kind of like an oval shape. These two are pretty close together. Okay, and then we get to this one that's kind of turned and bent. So I see this side is almost kind of like a flat line. And then I see the curve of it here. I'm paying attention to what I see as I'm sketching, like I'm noticing lines in the center, almost like little fuzzy parts, but I'm not worried about sketching those yet. I'm just kind of taking it all in for right now. So I'm getting the general shape. And you see I started with really light lines, and then I'm kind of going to go back and darken my lines a little bit, but I don't want to get too dark yet. Watercolor is all about preserving the light. So I'm going to try to keep this as light as I can until the very end. So I've got a good sketch. This is kind of like the skeleton or the bones of my composition. And now I can start thinking about filling in with color. Okay. So in this palette, I have all different colors, and you might think, oh, this flower is orange and yellow. That's all I really need. But I can make some colors darker using my cool colors or my blues and green, and I can make colors lighter using my yellow or my yellow ochre. I can also make colors lighter by adding white. When the colors come right out of my paint well, they're going to be really saturated, really rich. So I want to start light, so the more water I add to these colors, the lighter they're going to be. So you guys have an extra piece of paper in your watercolor kit so that you can experiment with the colors and the values. How light or how dark is this going to be? So I've got my water cup and my brushes, and I've got a sponge for dabbing away the extra water. I want to try to keep my palette nice and clean. So in between each color, I'm going to rinse my brush by touching the bottom of the cup, take it out, wipe the extra water off, and dab the brush gently to get the extra water off. So I'm going to start by filling in my colors, but I want to start lighter than I actually see them. And in some cases, I might even start just by using water. You'll see how that activates the watercolor pencil that I had and starts to turn it into paint. So I'm dampening just the shape of this petal. Dampening just the shape, or just the shape of this petal. And the watercolor pencil is starting to kind of fill in a little bit of value so I can see my shape a little bit more clearly. So I can think about the brush that I'm using based on the size of the area I'm trying to work on. If I'm working on this little tiny space, I might use a little tiny brush. If I'm working on a larger space, I might want to use a larger brush. So now that I've dampened these areas is a good time to start experimenting with wet into wet. So if I just drop some color in, you see that it wants to fill that petal. But it can only go as far as the water is. It's not going to jump outside that damp area into the dry paper. It can only stay within the area that's dampened or a little bit wet. So as this is blooming or filling in the space or going wet into wet, you can see that the watercolor starts to kind of mimic what the flower petal does. I see it looks kind of like it's blooming. I can experiment with color mixing in this way too. If I wanted to make a little bit more of a light orange, I could add a little bit of yellow into that petal. And you see the colors start to mix and create a really fluid, beautiful design within the petal. So that's what our wet into wet looks like. I can also try kind of a dry brush technique. So that means just kind of using my paint on my dry paper. And I don't want to have any extra water. You'll notice the paint acts really differently where the paper is dry. It stays right where I put it and it doesn't move. Okay, so this is a pretty saturated color to start with, so I'm just going back with a little bit of water and filling in that shape so my color will get a little bit lighter as I add water. And I can show you that again. The more water you have, the lighter the color will be. This makes the paint more translucent and the white of the paper will shine through. So I'm kind of going around shape by shape and thinking about what color or what value, how light or dark the color should be. Once I've dampened, I can drop some color in, and you see that starts to fill in the form of the petals. And I'm using the water to move the color around. You'll notice my brush isn't working too hard. It's a really light touch. And I'm holding my brush kind of like I hold my pencil, and that gives me more control over where it goes. Each brush has a different vocabulary. So this particular pointed round brush could make a really wide mark if it's lying down on its side. Or if I stand it up, it could make a really tiny mark if I'm just barely touching the paper. It could make different types of brush strokes as well. So think about the vocabulary that each of your brushes have. The brushes don't like to be pushed or smashed. That really hurts the brush. We don't like to do that. We want to be really gentle with the brushes and keep all the bristles going in the same direction. So especially with this pointed round brush, I can get into kind of small spaces here. So the watercolor is going to follow the water. So if I have a wet area next to another wet area, the colors can spread together. You see if I put a little bit of yellow in here, it's going to mix with that orange of the other petal. So this is something to be careful of. If I want to keep my colors separated, I want to leave a little bit of dry paper in between. I don't want to go wet next to wet. Like if I wanted to get this stem of this petal, you see that's going to be really hard to do because this area was wet. They just want to blend together, blur together. So we try to control where our watercolor goes by where the paper is wet. If you have a paper towel, if you have something like this happen and you have a paper towel, you can just very gently dab and the color will come off on the paper towel really gently. And this is also called lifting. So I can lift that color with a clean paper towel. I don't want to use my sponge to do this because you can see how dirty it is. This is just for dabbing the extra water off. Yep, I got a little roly-poly visiting me here. So as I add more layers of color, you can see that the color becomes richer and more vibrant, and also darker. So I can look at different areas in my flower and decide where does it want to be dark, where does it want to be light. I see these beautiful stripes that are happening in the petals, and that's something that would be really nice to do with a detail watercolor pencil. You can really get those tiny marks. I could also use a small brush for that, but I have to wait for my paint to be dry. If I tried to put in those kind of detail marks right now, while my paper is wet, we'll show you what happens. They kind of bleed or blur or go in places where I didn't really want it. So we started out with larger brushes and larger areas, and as we get closer to finishing our painting, we can start adding smaller details and smaller marks. This is pretty wet right now, so I might need to wait for this to dry, and while I'm doing that, I can think about my background. In order to make this really stand out, I want to try using a contrasting color. So I'm taking my brush and I'm dampening the paper just around the petals. I don't want to touch any of the wet areas. I want to keep a barrier of dry paper around the petal so that those places don't touch. Then I can think about dropping in or adding a very contrasting color to make this really stand out. And you see as I'm dropping this blue and maybe even a little bit of purple in, it stays right where the paper was dampened. It can't go where the paper was dry. So the flower is protected because I left this little dry barrier in between. So the blue and the orange can't mix. So we can experiment with dropping color in, letting it bloom, and really let it do its thing organically. You'll notice it's really different when I do that with my paper is not damp. A lot of watercolor is experimenting with the way the media wants to be fluid. It wants to kind of flow. So you can experiment with that. And really being careful about letting the light areas shine through. If there's anything that's light in your painting, or anything that you want to be white, that's where you let the paper shine through. You see, we don't have white in the palette, so anything that we want to be light or white, we just let the paper shine through. If I want something to be really dark, I can keep adding layers and layers and layers of color on top, and that will allow the paint to darken. I'll show you in this one that's a little bit more dry. So here I wanted to create a really deep shadow inside the iris, so I can use my cadmium red and my phthalo blue to make a really dark shadow color. And I can put that shadow color on top of this other dark value, and it continues to make it darker and darker. So we're building the darks by layering. And the dark areas are the only places that keep getting these layers. Everywhere else, like if I wanted something to be light, I just put a little bit of color. If I wanted something to be white, I didn't put any color at all. So we're working again from observation, being inspired by what's around us, but creating our own beautiful original piece. Have fun!